Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! And we're back. Yes, this is a Wilsenton R300. And you know how much I hate this amp, but that was the early version. So I'm trying to look at this with fresh eyes. This is the new Plus model. Somebody sent me one. They wanted me to investigate the internals of it, see if they've fixed that issue that had a monster first capacitor, and if they've, who knows, if they still have the delay board in it that's going to shock the crap out of the tubes when it comes online like they tried doing. Or did they realize that my recommendation of the 5AR4 rectifier tube that's got an indirectly heated cathode is going to slowly bring the voltage up and keep these 300B tubes happy, and at the same time not fry the rectifier tubes. So I have to go inside the amp to look at that. First, we're going to put it on the audio analyzer suite and see if they in fact did fix the problem with the output transformers. And if you remember, on an early version of the R300, while I was fixing the power supply issues, doing 5AR4 rectifier tubes plus some capacitor changes, he wanted to put some Hashimoto output transformers on it. And while that fixed the super crazy square wave and that just ungodly dip at 15K on the output frequency response, sonically it wasn't a huge difference. I mean, I heard a little bit of improvement, but I feel like with this amp, because they're having to run such heavy negative feedback, which, like my 300B amp has zero negative feedback, it has basically the same distortion profile this amp has, running a ton of global negative feedback. Doing that, it negates or covers up the sonic differences in the output tubes, and in my opinion turns a 300B amp into sounding like a solid state amp, or more like one. And it kills a lot of the really good rich sound that a 300B tube has, and swapping the output tubes doesn't have much sonic difference. So again, we're going to test this thing on the audio analyzer suite, see if the output transformer issue's been solved. Then I'm going to look at the inside on the power supply and see what these Plus models have that the earlier ones didn't, that possibly will keep them from frying rectifier tubes like Pez candy. And then we're going to hook this thing up to my system and do some A/B testing with my DIY 300B amp versus what this thing sounds like. And yeah, probably swap some tubes around, see if it's still got that feature where changing the output tubes really doesn't change the sonic signature of the amp, and just see what this Plus model is all about. So let's hook this thing up to the Analog Discovery 2 and see what these output transformers are doing. Here we are again with the R300 Plus on the audio analyzer suite. And here we go. Left and right channel. Pretty good bit of difference between the two. You can see there's about a 0.5% distortion difference between the left and the right channel. We got 1% distortion at 1 watt. We got 1 3/4 at 2 watts, or 0.8, depending on which channel you're looking at. Get to 3 watts, and we got 1.2 or 2.3. We got 1% distortion difference between the channels here. When you get up to 4 watts, we got 1.5 and almost 3%. And then at 5 watts, 3.5, 2%. And right about in here is where it starts clipping at about 6 watts. And if we come over here to the scope, You can see here at 0.225 volts RMS in, you've got asymmetrical clipping on the bottom. And if we go up to 3 volts RMS, 0.3 volts RMS, you will see that got heavy asymmetrical clipping. Let's see how far it goes before we start clipping on the other side. And you can see massive clipping down here on the bottom, just starting to clip on the top. That's telling me got an amp that has got a really poorly designed something, whether it's the output stage or whether it's the input stage, I don't know, but amps shouldn't do stuff like this. So let's go back down to 0.2 volts RMS, and you see right there, we don't have any clipping. Let's take a look at the 100 hertz square wave, and you can see pretty heavy low frequency roll off. Got some pretty nasty ringing here, especially for the 100 hertz. Let's see what the 1000 hertz looks like. Okay, we got some pretty heavy ringing here at the start of it, but that's not really too bad. And then let's see what the 10K square wave looks like with these, quote, new output transformers. And, well, not as bad as the original R300, not what I would call beautiful square waves either. Especially an amp that's being pitched as being the amp of the year by several of these influencers. So here we got the frequency response on both channels. You can see it's got a little bit of brightness here on the top end. If you look at the upper numbers, you can see we got about 0.22 dBs down from 0 here, just the way this chart's reading. You get down in this range, so we got about 1/4 of a dB drop off between 10K and 100 hertz. When you get down to, let's see here, at 40 hertz, we're down about 1/2 a dB. And then at 20 hertz, we're down about 1.5 dBs. So low frequencies, not rock star good. This aligns exactly with what I heard. Had a pretty weak bass response. They did fix this nasty dip dive thing that was happening at 15K, but you can see whatever they did, it's now doing the same thing at 35K. It's not just rolling off, it's going into this weird jump dipsy doodle thing that it was doing before at 15K, but being up here at 35K, it's not going to be in any way audible. Not too concerned about that, but that's still kind of a weird looking frequency response curve that I haven't seen with any other kinds of output transformers other than what they've been using on this R300. We go to the THD versus frequency. You can see, and we're pulling this at 4 watts, which is half of the rated output. We're down here at 20 hertz. We've got almost 10% distortion. As it comes down here to 100 hertz, you've got 1.7 or 3% distortion depending on which channel you're looking at. And I'm not sure why one channel has so much more distortion than the other channel, but hey, that's just what it's doing. So if we come up here and look at the THD versus noise, you can see not a whole lot of noise, not enough to really get concerned about. If we look at the second order harmonics, it drops down a good bit, especially in this middle range here where you're going to have a lot of vocals and that kind of stuff. There's not a lot of second order harmonics in here, which I would like to see with a 300B tube. It's kind of the reason you buy a 300B amp. And then the third order harmonics is exactly the equal of the second order harmonics. So it's going to have equal amounts of good and the bad harmonic distortion, which is honestly the opposite of what you buy a 300B amp for. So again, I think that has a lot to do with them using the heavy global negative feedback, and then they still have not what I would call stellar THD versus frequency response. And again, I'm not sure what's going on with one channel's got so much more distortion than the other. I tried rotating the tubes from left to the right channel, and that didn't change anything. Now, I did notice that the left channel, this blue one, the bias adjuster is acting kind of flaky, which is pretty common from what I've seen on these Wilsenton amps. They use a super cheap bias adjusting pot, and I don't know if it's already failing in this amp or what's going on. I was able to find a spot in the pot where the bias would be stable, but again, they're running these tubes at almost melting temperatures and voltages, which we'll cover in the next section. And so overall, a pretty sad performance for an amp that, like I said, other influencers have been calling the amp of the year and better than the R8 and all that kind of stuff. Guys, it is simply nowhere near the amp that an R8 is. So if you're going to drop $1,500 on one of these made in China amps, do not buy this. Go buy an R8. So anyway, I'm going to jump into the next segment where we're going to talk about what I found inside with the power supply, what the overall inside looks like, and some of the voltages that I measured and the problems I found related to that. Okay, so I pulled the bottom cover off just to look inside to see what's going on inside this Plus model. Basically what they did is they followed Skunky mods once again, and they routed the outputs of these twin rectifier tubes. And don't let anybody try to fool you into like thinking these are some kind of a split rail power supply, or that this rectifier tube does one channel and this one does the other. They put them in parallel, and it's actually a waste of a 5AR4 rectifier tube, because I've been running my 300B amp with a single rectifier tube for years. There's plenty of capability in a good 5AR4 to operate a 300B amp. So I'm not sure why they're putting two in them, other than the current you're running. These rectifier tubes are going to make the transformer get really hot, the power transformer, because instead of 2 amps, you got 4 amps of heater current just for the rectifier tubes. So anyway, they did correct the earlier models. They had the outputs of these rectifier tubes going to a 330 UF first cap. So now they did like I showed y'all to do in an earlier video, to run the output of these two tubes to the 100 UF cap on the little board, then through the choke, and then to the big 330 UF cap inside the amp. And even then, 100 UF is kind of pushing the envelope about what I'd like to see for a first cap, but given that you've got 2 rectifier tubes running in parallel, and that reduces the load on them as well, it's not going to fry the rectifier tubes, but it is going to hammer the power transformer. So, anyway, power supply, probably not going to eat rectifier tubes like the early ones did. But this amp's got 460 volts on the plate of these output tubes. And here's several data sheets that I'm going to scroll through, and all of them say that 450 volts is the max you should run on a 300B tube. And honestly, something more around 350 to 380 volts is where you really should be running one of these tubes. So the odd thing is there's a pickup or a test point on the little power board that has a bunch of caps and stuff on it that is the output that goes to the output transformers that power up the 300B tubes, and it says 380 volts or plus 380 volts. And when you measure that point that they have marked as showing that it should be 380 volts, it's got 460 volts. And I ran into the same problem with, because this is the third or the fourth one of these R300s I've looked at. And guys, yes, no, I'm not working on any more of these. These things are junk. And I'm just tired of wasting my time with them. But every one of them had a different AC voltage power transformer. And I saw anywhere from one of them had like 390 volts on the plate to this one's got 460. And one of them had 430. And then one of them had, 415 or something. And one of them I used 5 U4 rectifier tubes to try to pull the voltage down a little bit, and that helped. So, if this was my amp, honestly, if this was my amp, I'd try to return it. Because it's got some other kind of weird issues too, which we'll get into in a second. But anyway, so I set the bias in the center on this channel, which the bias adjustment worked correctly. And when I measured the milliamps that the tube was pulling, they're running it at 80 milliamps. And again, all of these data charts say don't run over 70 milliamps through the tube if you're running fixed bias. So they've exceeded both the voltage and the milliamp rating. And if you do the bias calculation at 36 watts, which is what a lot of these 300B tubes are rated at, you're running it at over 100% plate dissipation. And even if you use a 40 watt rating, which is really pushing it for a 300B tube, you're at about 92 or 93%. Which, guys, it's one thing to run something like a JJ EL34 tube that's a $23 tube to run it really hot. It's a totally different thing to be just roasting the guts out of a 300B tube. And it doesn't even make great power. They're running the tubes right on the verge of red plating, and then they're getting 7 watts because they've got some crazy asymmetrical clipping that's probably coming out of this weird front end design this thing's got that requires a ton of global negative feedback, and it's still got a ton of distortion. And it's mostly third order. It doesn't have the good second order harmonic distortion that you buy a 300B amp for. And I know, especially you guys that are new to tubes, you've bought into this hype that, oh my God, I got to get a 300B amp. Every 300B, yeah, 300B, I want a 300B. It's like, buying a garbage 300B amp, it's not better than buying like a high quality EL34 or even a 6V6 amp. And if you want the triode sound, triode strap an EL34 or a KT88 or something else, and you're going to get real close to the sound without spending a fortune on the tubes. And if you're going to get a real 300B amp, get a real 300B amp and save your money up. People waste thousands of dollars buying these tofu dredge amps that, yeah, it's pretty and it's got super shiny automotive finish on these transformer cans that are full of gravel and epoxy with some little, cheapo output transformers inside it. And, maybe to the uninitiated, they see these cans and they go, ooh, those look like those ISO Tango transformers. Yeah, they're not even close. And realize that a pair of ISO Tango transformers this size or $1,000 or 2/3 of the price of this whole amp. So then when you consider the tubes that come in this thing are junk, and you're going to have to buy a new pair of 300B tubes, pair of good rectifier tubes. Good pair of rectifier tubes are going to be $150. You're going to spend $300 or $400 on a good pair of 300B tubes. And then by the time you buy a pair of good SN7s and a good SL7, you're going to have another $150, $200 in it. You're knocking on the door $2,500, and you've still got a junky tofu dredge, poorly engineered amplifier. You know, I see people on the forums going, yeah, I've got these super high efficiency speakers, and I use it for listening at low volume levels at night. It's like, guys, if you're using 3/4 of a watt, you know, buy something like a EL84 amp, or, you know, one of those deckware UFO kind of things. And there's other amps that are like that out there. And yeah, I know he's got a long waiting list, and that's because his stuff's not junk. And you can buy these on Amazon because they are junk. And they don't meet the specs. And this, the whole idea of using fixed bias on a 300B single-ended amp makes no sense. If it was a push-pull amp, I would say, yeah, okay, that maybe makes some sense. There's a reason why every other 300B amp on the planet has cathode bias or auto bias set up on it. And there's no performance disadvantage. My DIY amp's cathode bias, and it easily makes the same power as this with less distortion, and it gets zero negative feedback at all, of any kind, either local or global. And so, yeah, I was hoping that maybe they did like a real redesign on this thing, but basically they just sort of fixed the power supply so it doesn't grenade rectifier tubes, and they didn't change the power transformer to offset the reduced voltage drop of these 5AR4 rectifiers. So now they're overvolting the output tubes. And like I said, this one's already got a bias pot that's failing, or something weird's going on. You can sit there and watch the bias meter. This one channel just starts doing this kind of stuff out of the blue, and then it'll settle down. And then it might stay like that for 5-10 minutes or so, and then it starts jumping around again. I mean, I listened to this thing with these tubes that come in it, and it had a very weak bass to me. It sounded a lot like the A50 unmodified did. It doesn't have any kind of detail. You can hear the distortion, or I hear the distortion. Maybe some of you can't, I don't know. Or maybe you're using a 1/2 watt of power, and that's why it sounds okay. I don't know. To me, if you're using a 1/2 watt of power, why are you buying a 300B amp? That just doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, unlike some of these other folks, I'm going to give this the worst amp of the year that I've tested. And actually, that little $300 Musical Paradise MP301 sounds better than this amp does. So, that's $1,000 down the drain. So anyway, I know the owner of this is probably going to want me to dig into why this bias thing is acting weird and stuff. And I'm sorry, I'm just not interested in working on any more of these amps. They're just junk. Now the R8, the new second version that they did the Skunky mods on and all that, that's a decent amp. And I've actually still got the one that I got from them that I did my further, kind of took out the headphone jack, did some other little simple mods to it, put some better tubes in it, and it's a decent sounding amp. And at some point I may put some better output transformers in it. I don't know. But if you're going to buy one of these, Wilsenton anything, get an R8. Don't buy this R300. don't get sucked into the 300B tube hype. And if you really are just dead set on buying a 300B amp, get a dentist hat or get some other high quality, a used audio note on eBay or something. But guys, we got to stop buying this junk being made by these folks and being pitched to us as hi-fi gears. So anyway, yeah, not going to do any more stuff on this. I'm boxing this thing up after this video, send it back to the owner. He can deal with sending it off to the Wilsenton Repair Center or trying to get a refund or whatever he wants to do. I've got too much other stuff on my plate to keep trying to fix this junk. And so we're going to cut our losses here. So I hope you're enjoying this content. I try to keep things real here. Unlike some of these other channels that are out there or websites that seem to just candy coat everything, I'm going to tell y'all like it is. And hopefully that means when I tell you something's good, it actually is. And I'm not going to hype stuff, and I'm not going to cover for junk. So if you do enjoy this content, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Thanks to all you Patreon folks and you other supporters. Thanks to you guys that send me gear like this to review so I can tell y'all the truth about hi-fi gear. And until the next video, have a nice day.